Hello, my name is John Klar, and I'm here to discuss the legal case of Rick Stanley before the U.S. Supreme Court this Friday, March 28th. The reason I am deliberately here before you in a t-shirt is that we're here to talk about truth, not glitz. The American free market system generally says that you get what you pay for, but I can personally tell you that if you pay $300 an hour for a big city lawyer, you're probably paying for the fancy office and not any more brain power. Certainly no guarantee. When you watch Fox News, you get a lot of glitz and polish, but that doesn't mean you're getting any true information. So I'm wearing a t-shirt because I am not a bar attorney who is complicit in the enslavement of the American people, but I am an attorney admitted to the bar of the U.S. Supreme Court in the state of Connecticut who wishes to use my education to help educate people about what's going on in their country today. Rick Stanley is before the U.S. Supreme Court, as many of you know, because in Colorado in 2002, he deliberately defied a city ordinance which banned his ability to carry a firearm anymore. When he was convicted and about to go to jail, and the Colorado legislature struck down those ordinances, Rick Stanley felt that his constitutional rights had been compromised. And he issued a written statement to the courts, the trial court and the appellate court, in which he said that in view of the Colorado legislature's decision, if the courts did not reverse his convictions and release him, that he would cause a warrant to issue for the judge's arrest for treason for failing to uphold their oaths to enforce the U.S. Constitution and the Colorado Constitution. This landed Rick promptly in jail on two much more serious charges than possession of a gun. A gun possession charge was a 90 days maximum sentence. To try to influence a public official by threat was subject to up to 3 years in prison. Rick was charged with 2 counts, one for each of these pieces of paper, these political efforts to speak, in a court proceeding, 2 judges. He was then convicted, sentenced, maximum consecutive sentences, so instead of, as we often see, the 2 sentences running together for a total of 3 years, they've been stacked one upon the other. So Rick Stanley is in jail now for 6 years, losing his constitutional rights because he tried to speak out to the court. Right now I'm going to try to explain a little bit in lay people's terms what it is that's before the U.S. Supreme Court. Some people hear of Rick's case and they dismiss him and say, well, he butted heads with the court and he got what he deserved. Well, I'm afraid that's very un-American of you and based in a lack of information about what our laws are and what the Constitution means. Nobody's ever been convicted that I can find in America for threatening to arrest anyone. So what's going on here? Let's look a little bit at the background of the case law. We know what the First Amendment says. It says that we have a right to free speech. Generally, the courts have interpreted that to mean that I have an absolute right to say whatever I want, political, religious, even artistic, as long as I'm not impinging on others. What's not protected are certain areas of speech that are not really worthy of protection. True threats being one of them. If I threaten to kill someone, that's not free speech at all. That's a violent act. The federal government and the state governments over the years have clearly delineated that we have a free speech right and that the burden is a weighty burden on the government to prove that they have a basis or foundation anytime they restrict that right. What this court did in Rick Stanley's case was they determined that it did not matter whether or not he intended to threaten anyone. Usually a criminal element, when a foundational element of any crime, for most crimes, most serious crimes, is an intent to kill, an intent to steal, an intent to deprive someone of their property. In Rick Stanley's case, the court ruled that it was not required to prove that Rick Stanley intended to intimidate or threaten the judges. Instead, the judges were put up on the stand and their evidence was presented to the jury to demonstrate whether or not they believed that they had been threatened. This is squarely against our laws. The Supreme Court in 2003, in a case called Virginia versus Black, ruled that a statute which made burning crosses illegal was unconstitutional because it assumed that if you burned a cross, you did so with an intent to intimidate. And the Supreme Court said in Virginia versus Black in very clear language that in order for the government to criminalize our speech rights, in order for the government to curtail our First Amendment right, that they must demonstrate a subjective intent to threaten or cause harm or intimidate in order to criminalize that conduct. The Colorado courts completely disregarded the U.S. Supreme Court's decision in Virginia versus Black. that allowed them to convict Rick Stanley when he had no real intent to threaten anybody. He was just trying to call attention to the runaway government which is taking away our rights. What that also allowed the court to do was to exclude a lot of the contextual evidence surrounding Rick's arrest. Because the jury was not allowed to look at Rick's intent in saying this, much of the political circumstances surrounding his speech were removed from their consideration. Now I offer to you again the Supreme Court's precedent in another case, United States versus Watts. In 1969, when this country was at war in Vietnam, a fellow named Watts stood up in Washington, D.C., having been drafted, and said publicly, if they force me into the military and put a gun in my hands, the first thing I will do is set my sights on LBJ. He was charged with threatening to kill the president. He was given completely a suspended sentence in probation. He didn't serve, as I understand, a single day in jail. And that case went in 1969 to our United States Supreme Court, which struck down his conviction. They didn't even send it back down for another trial. They said this was obvious political hyperbole when you examine the context of the speech. How can we have a free speech right if we are not to look at the context in which it is spoken? We have a man who is running for office, campaigning for office about a specific constitutional issue, who exercised his First Amendment constitutional right to speak in support of that Second Amendment right to bear arms. When his rights were curtailed, whether you think he was right or not to take such a stand, when his rights were curtailed, all of our rights are curtailed. The government could apply this in any state. A protest against abortion or for choice. A protest against the Iraq War. The government is changing our Constitution before our eyes. If the U.S. Supreme Court does not hear this case next Friday, it will be sending a message, putting its stamp of approval on government action directly in conflict with its decisions, directly in conflict with our U.S. Constitution. This document was provided to us, the American people, by our founding fathers as custodians. It was not provided to us to give to those who would enslave us, to our government, to look over us. It was there to restrict government, not to restrict us. And it is our power, not their power, to invoke. The question at issue in Rick Stanley's case is if the government does curtail your Second Amendment freedoms or other freedoms, do you have a right to protest about it? How far can you go? Does it strike anyone a little bit troubling that the judges that Rick was protesting against had the absolute power to incarcerate him for a long period of time based totally on or what they believed or supposedly believed was a threat? Now we have judges who will not broach criticism. Our Supreme Court has repeatedly enunciated what we can all see as common sense. The judges should not have this kind of power. Politicians should not have this kind of power. That's why we have a free speech right, so that we can speak truth to power, so that we can speak our minds and try to hold them accountable, so that we can criticize a judge who is racist, prejudiced, ignorant, or stifling our rights. We must ask why the federal government was spending our tax dollars to conduct surveillance against Rick Stanley from the very beginning of this case. This case is not about gun rights, though it is secondarily. It's about the First Amendment. It's about my right to speak to you right now and not be intimidated by a government that might come and take away my home or incarcerate me because I try to stand for what they have taught me I'm supposed to believe in. Now is the time to spread the information, to use the alternative media, to educate the American people about that which our government does not want us to know. And I thank you again, and God bless you.